Hi, my name is Carly, and welcome to Arise's Sermon of the Week. We hope that you experience God as you listen to this message, and that you find practical ways to be the hands and feet of Jesus within your community. So, let's open up our spiritual ears as we listen to this message.
Hey, good morning, Risers. How you guys doing? You awake? You alive this morning? Welcome. If you're new to our church, my name is Brent. I get the privilege of being your lead pastor, and we're going to continue to experience God together today. Hey, we always want to celebrate as we get started, and today, first Sunday of the month, we always honor one of our amazing volunteers, and I do want to say we have the most amazing volunteers on the planet at Arise. Can I get a whoop whoop? Yeah. And people never know who we're honoring until we honor them, and so Joe and Melissa Buchanan, we just want to honor you guys. Y'all come up real fast. One of the most fun things is to see people's reaction when you call them out of the crowd. And Joe and Melissa are amazing. They've been at our church for a number of years now. I've known Joe and Melissa since we had hair. Me and Joe, that is. And we were a lot thinner, and we played basketball. And we've been friends for a long time, but they've been a part of our church for quite a while. Melissa serves in several ministries, especially our prayer ministry. Joe helps me out personally some things and is a big part of our youth ministry. He's probably the main speaker when Pastor Kieran's not speaking, is probably Joe. And just amazing people. We want to honor them. And as always, we have cheesy gifts to give you. You guys are fire, so you get Dentine Fire. We just want to honor you guys and say thank you for your service. Love y'all. Joe is a preacher. One day he'll be up here on this stage and you'll never want me back. So love both of them. Joe also has a prophetic mantle in his life, and Melissa, I just love their family in general. All right. So today, we talk a lot about the Bible in church, right? And we should, right? I mean, that's kind of the fundamental thing. If you're ever preaching and you're not preaching the Bible, something's probably wrong. And we live in a society where the Bible might not be appreciated as much as it once was, but traditionally the Bible is very much a central part of our country and a part of our world. For instance, George Washington once said this. He said, "It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible." Abraham Lincoln said it this way. He said, "I believe the Bible is the best gift God has ever given to man. All the good from the Savior of the world is communicated to us through this book." Charles Dickens said the New Testament is the very best book that ever was or ever will be known to the world. And if you want a really convicting one, Gandhi, who's obviously not even a Christian, once said this. He said this: "You Christians look after a document containing enough dynamite to blow all civilization to pieces, turn the world upside down, and bring peace to a battle-torn planet. You treat it as though it is nothing more than a piece of literature." Ouch! Ouch! So the Bible is this interesting book that we say that we esteem, but we generally don't read all that often. In fact, most people, I think, are pretty curious about it. And the Bible is really the most studied book of all times. It's the most translated book of all times. It's the most quoted book of all times. It's without a doubt the most influential book of all times. And by the way, it's the best-selling book of all times, which most people have heard. What you may not ever notice or pay attention to is not only is it the best-selling book of all times, it's actually the best-selling book every year. They don't put it on the list because it just gets monotonous and it's just kind of silly after a while. But it's the best-selling book every single year as well. And at the same time that it's so esteemed, it's also not read that often. In fact, I could say it this way. It's strange that those who claim to love the Bible, honor the Bible, treasure it, say they believe it and base their life by it, have often never read it. Think about that. At least not entirely. Some people are like, I read the Bible, but have you read the whole Bible? Because most Christians, and I'm not saying all of you, some of you might say something different, but most people would say, I base my life off of this book. But the fact is, when you got to the book of Leviticus, you skipped some chapters. I've read the Bible, yeah, but did you read all of the prophets? Because so often we say we base our life on something that we've never read. And then we stand before an atheist or an agnostic and they're like, you haven't even read this book that you claim is the foundation of your life. And so, and let's be real for a second. It's hard because this is a long book. Have you ever read the Bible? It's a long book. You're not going to pick it up over coffee this afternoon and have a nice read and finish it. It's not going to happen. And it's a long book. In fact, it's more than just a book. It's really 66 ancient books that's collected together. And by the way, you could say it's 62 depending on how you count them. If you don't know what that means, that's why you need to be in this series. I'm going to explain that later on. But it could be 62. But it's all these ancient books compiled together, books and letters compiled that we leather bound and we call the Bible. Based on an Old Covenant, an Old Testament, and a New Testament, we put it together and call it the Bible. In fact, there are 1,189 chapters in the Bible, 31,173 verses, and depending on what translation you're using, roughly 800,000 words. Some of you are like, my wife used 800,000 words yesterday, but this is the Bible. You're actually listening and paying attention to it. Okay. I don't know where that just came from. So, my wife is taking notes. So, to read this book, you're not just going to suddenly sit down and read it over a cup of coffee. It's big, it's overwhelming, it can be intimidating, and sometimes, if we're honest, we start and we don't know where to start, or we start one place, we get to something confusing, we never actually get past that. And so there's all these reasons why we don't read the Bible, and so it ends up sitting on coffee tables or in bookshelves, or like some people, it sits on the back of your back seat in your car, or it's an app on your phone that you pull up every Sunday whenever I preach something, or you just read it off of the screen every Sunday. So it ends up collecting dust at the end of the day, no matter how we cut it. Now, I was introduced a few years ago to an app called Blinkist. I'm a big Blinkist fan. Blinkist is an app that takes books and basically turns them into footnotes, and you can read or get the gist of an entire book in 15 minutes. It's a beautiful thing. I love it. And in fact, one time, to give you a picture of this, you ever order a book online because you hear the author and you're like, and then you get it and you're like, no. So I heard Robert Greene talking about the laws of human nature. It's kind of like a psychology book. And I ordered it thinking, oh yeah, that sounds really interesting. And then I realized it's 600 pages. Yeah, not light reading either. Looks kind of like the Bible, actually. And so I realized I wasn't going to do that. So what did I do? I went on Blinkist and I started on Blinkist. And in 15 minutes, I got the gist of the book. Now, it's not the same, for sure, but you can get the idea of the whole thing in a short amount of time. Now, it just turns it into footnotes. How many would be interested if we could take the long Bible, 66 books, 800,000 words, and turn it into a short segment that we can get the gist of the whole thing in a matter of weeks? Would that interest you? Yes. I'm glad y'all said yes. Some people in the first service were so spiritual, they said no. And I was like, wow, hurt my feelings. And so that's what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks in our church. We're going to get the big picture overview. You know, sometimes you can miss the forest for the trees. You can be so caught up in a little thing that you miss the big picture. And I think for all of us, this is going to be a fun time as we say, we're going to make this long story short. So with that being said, here's the rule. Buckle your seatbelts, pull down your lap bars. It's about to get crazy, and there's a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Be here every single week. Bring somebody with you. It's going to be fun, but it's a lot of content. And what we're going to do each week, or most weeks, is take the biblical side, walk through the books, which is usually not terribly practical for you. It's going to feel academic. It's going to feel like you're in a college classroom or something maybe. And it's not terribly practical. So we're going to take about half or so of the practicality of just walking through these things, telling the big picture story, and then the second half, we will break it down into some nuggets that are practical for our lives. Does that sound good? Yeah. So I'm excited about this series. And if you're going to start with the Bible, where do you start? You start in the beginning and what we call the Pentateuch. The Bible starts with these first 5 books of the Bible called the Pentateuch. The word Pentateuch just means 5 books. That's what it means in Greek. It's just 5 books, and that's why we call it the Pentateuch. If you come from a Jewish background or a Hebrew background, they would call it the law. You might hear Jesus refer during the Gospels to the law and the prophets. When he says the law or the Torah, that's what he's talking about right here. It's the first 5 books of the Bible. These were written and compiled by Moses, probably between 1446 and 1406 BC. So Moses may or may not have written all of them, but it seems to be that he at least compiled them for us today. And it really spans the time all the way from creation, and you can debate when that was, all the way from creation, all the way until the time that the people are about to come out. They've come out of the Exodus and they're about to take the promised land. But I'm going to get in the cart before the horse, so let's break it down a little further. Genesis. If you're going to start in the beginning, start in Genesis, because what does Genesis mean? Beginning or origin. That's what it means. And so let's start in the book of Genesis. And the book of Genesis can be divided into 2 sections. You really have Genesis 1 through 11, which is the story of God and the world. And then you have Genesis 12 through 50, which is the story of God and his covenant people and Abraham and how that gets started. And so in Genesis 1 through 3, you see the creation account, and God creates a human there, a man. In the Hebrew, it would be Adam. You know him as Adam. That's what Adam means, is just man or humankind. He makes them, and he puts Adam and Eve in this garden, and he makes them to rule over the world. He basically makes them a governor for him to take care of the planet, and especially the garden that he's put them in, and to really run it and create beauty and order and keep everything going the way it's supposed to go. And as part of this, God creates them and he gives them a choice, because love always gives a choice. If you don't have free will, it's not really love. And so he says everything is the garden is yours except this one tree, symbolic of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is that picture of the temptation of sin and doing it your own way. And sure enough, you probably know man rebels really quickly and they fall and everything starts spinning out of control from then on. In fact, Jesus or God is the life giver. And the second you turn your back on God, you turn your back on life. And so you begin to die. And that's what happens right there. So people begin to die. And in the middle of this spiral out of control, you see this kind of weird prophecy. That if you were just reading the Bible for the first time and you did not know what most of you know in the New Covenant and about Jesus, you would think this is kind of out of the blue. This is kind of strange. And God gives this prophecy as all is spinning out of control. God looks at the woman and says, your offspring or your seed will eventually crush the snake's head. The same snake that was just tempting you and trying to destroy you. And it's kind of out of place. It's kind of like, what does that have to do with anything? Well, that's one of the very first messianic prophecies that Jesus is going to fulfill. And so, and then everything starts spinning out of control. The world starts to change under the weight of sin now. And you have the famous stories like Cain and Abel and the first murder. You have the Nephilim. Everybody's always interested in those folks, right? The daughters of men and the sons of God marry and have these weird children. And everybody's always curious about that. One day we'll talk about that and everybody will show up because it's just fun. And they're like, what does that mean? And everybody has their own theories. And you get Noah in the flood and then the Tower of Babel, because you have a new technology of brick at that time period. And they're building this Tower of Babel and all those stories, which lead into Genesis 12. After God and creation, God is going to have one person that's going to be his special person that you see for the rest of the Bible mentioned over and over. And of course, his name is Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons, many. See, if you didn't grow up in church right now, you're just like, what is that? It's like we just had a mob. So Enter Abraham, and Abraham is this guy. He seems to have nothing to do with nothing. Who is he? And God chooses to bless him. Still to this day, people say, why did God choose Abraham? Nobody knows, right? He did. It's just what he does. Same reason God chooses you and I. I don't know why he wants me, but he did. God chooses Abraham and chooses to bless him, and he says some things to Abraham that are pretty ridiculous. He says that your offspring will be like the sand on the shore and the stars in the sky. Well, that's all well and good, except for the fact that Abraham had never had a child, and his wife seemed to be barren. And so it didn't seem to add up. But the biggest thing that he said to him is that through your offspring, all nations of the earth will be blessed. But that's also pretty wild. Nowadays that kind of makes sense, but back at that time period, you did not bless all nations of the earth. You destroyed the other nations of the earth. It's a different world than we live in now. And so that was kind of wild. And he also said, there's land I'm going to give you that's going to be yours, and it's special. That land would forever be known as the Promised Land. In fact, some of you will go with us on a trip later on to the Holy Land. That's all part of the promise that came from Abraham, and that's why we call it the Promised Land. And I want you to see this, because this is going to paint a picture throughout the Pentateuch that God is still choosing to bless humanity, still choosing to bless Adam, humans, even amidst our rebellion. Even amidst everything being wrong, he's still choosing to partner and bless humans. And God wants to use Abraham's family to show the world what he looks like, what his kingdom looks like, what his way of doing things looks like, and ultimately to fulfill the promise of blessing the earth, which I don't know, but might be connected with that same promise that God made to crush the head of the serpent. But we'll get there. All right, so then Genesis 13 through 50, you get the whole story of Abraham that many of you have heard. Abraham had many sons, and Abraham had Isaac, and he was tempted to sacrifice Isaac at one point by God, and this whole story unravels. And then Isaac has a son as he grows up by the name of Jacob, and Jacob was a swindler, and he was a mess, and there's all these cool stories about them that we don't get to share now. And then Jacob has 12 sons, and through his offspring, interesting things starts happening. But what I want you to see is that in the middle of all these stories, there is a rapid amount of brokenness and junk and garbage and mistake after mistake after mistake. And if I were God, I'll just be honest, I'd be like wiping my hands and be like, you guys figure this out on your own. I'm done with you people. But over and over and over, we see the faithfulness of God despite the unfaithfulness of Abraham's lineage. And so eventually Jacob, who has swindled his brother out of a birthright and these things that were a big deal at the time, eventually Jacob starts going back to his brother, and he meets God next to a river called Jabbok. And as he's meeting God at this river, it's this weird thing that happens. It's WrestleMania, and God and Jacob wrestle next to this river. There's a lot of interpretations about what that means. But for the point of today, all I really want you to see is that when they get done wrestling, God renames Jacob. And he says, you will no longer be known as Jacob, but you will be known as Israel. Israel means someone who wrestles with God. That's all it means. He said, you'll be known as Israel. And to this day, we still travel to the Holy Land, the Promised Land, which is now called, y'all paying attention with me? I know, we're all academic for a minute. We still travel to Israel to this day because Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And later on you will hear us talk about Israelites, right? The sons of Jacob. We don't call them Abrahamites. I don't know why, but that's just the way it's kind of played out in history. So Jacob had this problem though because he had a younger son that he loved very much. You might have heard of Jacob in the coat of many colors, and as he loves his sons, his son Jacob, his other sons, as he loves his son Joseph, his other sons get really annoyed with that and get frustrated with that, so they sell their brother into slavery. And there's some caravan going to Egypt, and they're like, we're going to sell him to Egypt, we'll never see him again, we'll lie and say he was eaten by an animal to dad, everything's all well and good. So that's where the story takes this interesting turn. So Joseph is sold into slavery, goes into Egypt, and because of God's blessing on his life, despite the junk of the family, Joseph starts going up the ranks in Egypt and essentially becomes a prime minister at the end, basically second in command of all of Egypt. Well, that wouldn't really matter all that much at all, except a famine hits the land. And in those days, when you had a famine, it was a massive problem. People die over this. Jacob had prophesied the famine was coming, prepared for it, and all of a sudden, all those same brothers who had sold him into slavery and their sons are coming back to him wanting food, not realizing who he is. And they come back, and eventually Joseph shows them who he is and says, listen, I'm the brother. And he says this wild thing to them. He says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. This can sum up the entire book of Genesis right there. Man does evil, God keeps being good to them anyway. Man does not deserve God's blessing, God keeps blessing them anyway. He's continuing his covenant. And so as the brothers come in, he says, listen, I will take care of you, I will love you. And he brings Abraham. Now Abraham's an old man at this point, but he brings Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all of them come back in. I'm sorry, Abraham's passed, but he brings in Jacob, his father. All of them come back in, and he puts him in this land right outside of Egypt called Goshen. Are y'all still with me? It's a big story. We haven't even got out of Genesis yet. Puts them in this land right there called Goshen, and they kind of take up residence right there, and beautiful things start happening. And that's where we pick up the story, because Genesis just kind of ends right there, picking up the story in Exodus. And Exodus starts out where Genesis ended. The people of God, the Israelites now, that's what they're going to be called from this time period on, and some people might call them Hebrews because of their language, but he sees these people that are here in Egypt. As those people are there was roughly about 70 that came into Egypt. The Bible jumps ahead about 430 years in the time, and all of a sudden those 70 have turned into estimated between 2 and 3 million. And somewhere along the way, people were like, the Pharaoh was like, listen, these people are becoming so numerous, they could overpower us. So we cannot have them overpowering us. We got to put our thumb down on these people and control these people. And so he makes them slaves to Egypt. And so he got scared and made them slaves. And that's where maybe one of the most famous figures in the Bible comes into the story, Moses. Pharaoh is trying to protect what is his, and so he's basically commanding the women to have abortions and kill the firstborn sons and all this. And Moses is protected by his mother and put into a basket and floats down the Nile River right up to the princess's house. And the princess walks down and finds this little baby and thinks he's so cute, draws him out of the water, which is what the word Moses means. The name Moses, drawn out, draws him out of the water, gives him the name Moses. And even though he is a Jew, even though he's an Israelite, she raises him in Pharaoh's household, so he probably had the best education, the best knowledge, best of everything inside of Pharaoh's household. Eventually, Moses kind of backslides and kills somebody, runs off in the desert by himself. While he's in the desert, you have this burning bush experience where God speaks to Moses and says, go back and redeem my people out of bondage. So he goes back and goes and stands before Pharaoh and says those famous words, let my people go, right? And he says those famous words, and Pharaoh says, have you lost your ever-loving mind? Who do you think you are telling me to let your people go? You grew up in my household like Moses. Come on, bro. And so he says no over and over, which leads to what became famously known as the 10 plagues. Every time Moses would say no, every time Pharaoh would say no, then all of a sudden a new plague would come. And these were kind of weird plagues. There's locusts and frogs and all kinds of weird kind of things happening, but it was detrimental at the time and a big deal. Finally, and there was at least once in there that the Pharaoh said, all right, you can go, psych, and he pulled him back in the next day. And but ultimately he refused to let them leave. And in Moses, eventually the 10th plague was the big one, and it's what you call the Passover. And basically the 10th plague said that if you do not put the blood of a lamb over your doorpost, then all of a sudden when a death angel comes, he will kill all the children, all the firstborn sons, unless the blood of the lamb is there. And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. All of a sudden, Pharaoh decided to let the people leave because there was wailing and gnashing of teeth all over Egypt with sadness, and people were distraught. So he lets them go. Finally, Pharaoh lets them go, only to change his mind after they've left the city and chase them down next to what we call the Red Sea. And that's a famous story as well, where Moses puts his staff in the sea and it splits and the Israelites cross over. The Egyptians follow behind. And then, Moses looks back and says, nana, nana, boo, boo. And all of the, just making sure you're paying attention. And then all of the water crashes back and kills all of the Egyptians behind him. And they sing these beautiful praises to God on the other side of the Red Sea. From there, they go right to this place called Sinai. And at Sinai, Moses walks up to the top of the mountain and he receives the 10 Commandments. You're right, Charleston Heston stuff. You've seen this. The 10 Commandments become the basic terms of the agreement or the covenant that these new people are going to have with God. He says, you will be my people if you follow these rules. Now, those 10 became much more later on in following books that we'll see in a minute. But these were kind of the very basics of the terms to being God's people. And these laws were meant to separate them from every other nation on the earth and mark them as God's people. But more importantly than the Ten Commandments, which might sound heretical if you grew up in church, more importantly than the Ten Commandments was actually this other thing that came right out of that as they're sitting at the base of Mount Sinai, and that is the tabernacle. God says, not only do I want to give you laws to follow to be my people, but I actually want to dwell and live with you. He's creating an Eden experience all these years later at Mount Sinai. And he says, I want you to build for me a tabernacle, a mobile tent that I will dwell in. And this incredible things happen as God gives all this symbolic detail of what the tabernacle should look like. And it's really beautiful to see, but we don't have time to get into all of it now. And so now Israel could experience and have access to God's presence all over again. Now, there's another theme that you're going to see throughout the Old Testament and really much of the New as well, and that is that while things looked great and were great and wonderful, and Moses goes up on the mountain to get the tabernacle design and the plans for the tabernacle, the people rebel, and this is kind of a continuing theme that we'll see throughout, at least today. So he comes down from the mountain, he's all upset, and Exodus ends, as all this kind of works itself out, but Exodus ends with the finishing of the tabernacle. They finally built it. And the glory of God comes and inhabits this mobile tent, this tabernacle. The glory of God shows up in some kind of tangible way. Now, there's a problem, though, and the problem is this. Moses can't enter God's presence. That's weird because God has been with Moses on the mountain. He's been with Moses all these times. He's talked to Moses face to face, we'll see. But he cannot go into the tabernacle. Enter the book that's everybody's favorite, the book of Leviticus. We all love that book. In the start of the book of Leviticus, you see God calling to Moses from the tabernacle. This is important. And this is what we need to see and why we need to see Leviticus in a different light. God is calling to Moses from the tabernacle because God is holy and Moses could not enter his presence yet because he was not holy. And we see this. And so Leviticus deals with this issue and shows how we can take into God's presence, how we can go into God's presence. And basically that God is holy, therefore we must be holy. In order to have a relationship with a holy God, we must be holy because unholiness can't enter his presence. Thus the book of Leviticus, which is all these rituals and sacrifices and feasts and rules for the priests and how they were expected to live in order to remain holy. These were the rules for purity and holiness. And here's the good part of Leviticus, and this is the reason I would tell you you should read it. Because you should read Leviticus at least once, just so you can appreciate what Jesus did for you. Because if you wanted a pathway to God apart from Jesus, go back and follow all of those rules in Leviticus. Which is what Peter and Paul and these New Testament figures point over and over and say, stop trying to live under the law. We couldn't do it. That is the law. And he's saying, guys, you don't have to do all these things any longer now through the blood of Jesus. But you should read it just for that, if nothing else. The book concludes with a call to faithfulness, the book of Leviticus, and the expectations and the saying to follow them, and then pointing out once again that if you don't follow these expectations, disaster looms, which leads right into the book of Numbers, which is important because Numbers 1:1, as the book starts, now you see God speaking to Moses in the tent, which means Leviticus worked. Right? So now Moses has made himself clean. He's following God's standards, all of his rules to be holy. And now Moses can now enter the tent of meetings, the tent of the tabernacle. And this shows that Leviticus worked. Now Moses was able to enter God's presence again. At this point, they've been at Sinai. All of this has just happened at Sinai. They've just crossed the Red Sea over the course of about a year. And now it's time. We've been here for a year. Let's set off for this promised land that you promised our forefather Abraham many years ago, that we've gossiped and told about at every family reunion. All those years ago, let's enter and let's go to the promised land. They are setting up to go after a year at Mount Sinai. And that's where Moses numbers the people. That's where we get that's why we get the name Numbers, the book of the Bible. He numbers the people and he arranges them according to their tribes surrounding the tabernacle. It's kind of civic planning. So around the tabernacle, he is now arranging them and putting them according to their tribes. And right about here, everything is going great. And throughout the Old Testament, and sometimes in the New Testament as well, as soon as everything seems to be going great is right when everything starts going wrong. Because what happens? The people start complaining. They've been here for a year. They're getting tired. They're walking, over to the promised land, and they start griping and complaining. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. Things are not going well. Why don't you just let us go back to Egypt? At least we had food there. And all this stuff starts going. And Moses starts dealing with the griping and complaining of the Israelite people. Moses then sends spies as they get closer to the Jordan, which kind of separates the promised land from outside of the promised land. He sends spies over to go check it out and see what's going on. And the spies come back, the majority of them, with a negative report. Not that the land was not good, the land was great, but that we could not defeat them. These guys are giant. They all look like Shaquille O'Neal and LeBron James, and we cannot handle these guys. They will flick us like a booger. We cannot beat these guys. That's the Brent version of it. We can't beat these guys. And so instead of trusting in the promises of God, the people rebel and say, no way, we ain't taking these guys on. We can't defeat them. Which leads to God saying, all right, if you're not going to trust me, then I don't want you to go into the land at all. And so God puts them in a 40-year timeout and says, you're going to wander around in this desert area for 40 years in these tents and just kind of wander around. And even in the midst of their unfaithfulness, God is faithful again. He keeps supplying for them, keeps taking care of them. And over and over and over again in this story, what you keep seeing is that people are complaining and rebelling, but God still keeps taking care of them because of His promise to Abraham. To the extent that even at one point, Moses kind of obeys God, but does it in the wrong attitude, hits a rock for water to come out, and does it in the wrong attitude, and seems to take credit for it himself a little bit. And God says to Moses, listen, you ain't going in the promised land either. So all of you are going to die out here. All of you are going to stay in timeout until all of you can appreciate what I've done for you, essentially. Numbers can be described as Israelites' disastrous road trip. So everybody is rebelling, and God says, listen, until this generation has passed away, I will not allow you to enter the promised land. These stories, by the way, are going to be told over and over and over again in the prophets and the poets and even later on in the New Testament to describe how God is faithful even amidst our unfaithfulness. Now, the book of Numbers ends with this new generation having been born and coming up, and they are ready to enter the promised land. Now we walk into Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a Greek word that just means second law. Second law. So it's the second law because it's Moses speaking here. And what Deuteronomy really is a series of speeches or sermons by Moses given to this new generation and reminding them of the epic story of how God rescued them out of bondage, how God brought them from where they came from, and reminding them to be faithful to God unlike their ancestors. And so all these speeches are going on, and he's recapping the Exodus story. You got to remember, these are people now that weren't there at the Red Sea. They weren't there. They heard the stories from their parents, but they weren't there themselves. And so he's recapping and telling them all of this, and he's constantly reminding them that if they follow God and do His laws and do what's right, God will take care of them. But if they don't, destruction comes. And so he's recapping all of this. Maybe the great recap, just to show you the book of Deuteronomy in a couple verses, is Deuteronomy 30, 15 through 20. Much of Deuteronomy looks like this. He says this, "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to Him, and to keep His commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to the gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Now choose life that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God and listen to His voice and hold fast to Him." And so that's really what you see in Deuteronomy, this epic retelling of everything that's happened to this new generation, and then these consistent warnings. Follow God, don't be like your parents and grandparents, be obedient to Him, and He will take care of you. And it's these sermons all from Moses. Deuteronomy, and hence the Pentateuch, ends with the death of Moses. The people are on the verge of taking the promised land, and Moses dies. And next week, we will look at what happens when they finally start going into the land. And you just heard the first 5 books of the Bible in, I don't know, we didn't get a timer going, but in a short amount of time. Y'all got it now? Sometimes you can miss the forest for the trees. This is the big picture of what you see happening in those first 5 books, the Pentateuch or the Torah, the law. Now, let's take a step back for a second and look at what's happening here and how this applies to our lives. I just want to give you 3 big points of how this applies to your lives now, okay? Number 1 is this. You are God's special creation. You are God's special creation. Genesis is clear that you were created in the image of God. This is so important because the fact that you were created according to Genesis in the image of God gives you what's called intrinsic value. Most of society values you based on what you produce. So as long as you're producing something, I value you. As long as you're good, I value you. As long as you're making this or making the world better or whatever, as long as you're fulfilling a job, I value you. That's the modern way. But if you're going to value people that for one reason or another cannot produce, maybe they have physical or mental handicaps or other things like that, or children. Children don't produce much except headaches. Come on, y'all. Just kidding. I love you, Elijah. He's right here. Children take a lot more than they give until they grow up, right? And so if you're going to have intrinsic value, if you're going to have value beyond what you produce, you have to have intrinsic value. And it's so important that we see it this way because it doesn't matter what someone else has told you about yourself and how worthless they had made you feel. It doesn't matter what you've told yourself about yourself. You have value according to this book. And if you're going to live your life on this book, it means you have to accept the fact that God made me valuable because He made me in His image. This is what we would call, the theologians would call the imago Dei. You were made in the very image of God and you have the imago Dei upon you. That's very important because with that understanding, you need to understand this. Christianity is the basis of human rights. Let that sink in. Because Christianity says you are valuable no matter whether you produce or not because of Genesis 1 through 3. You were made in the image of God. This is what we have in our society today. We have a generation coming up that loves human rights and they value human rights. And I value human rights. I'm fully on board with that. We are 100% on board with that because the Bible is. We value human rights. But at the same time that we are valuing human rights and humans, we are also walking away from the Bible. At some point, we will get to the place, once we've walked away from the Bible, that we will look back and say, why do we value this? Why do we value people? If they can't produce, there is no reason to value people. Look at the Holocaust. If they can't produce, the Holocaust started, when they first started taking people to be killed, it didn't start with the Jewish people alone. It started with children who had problems and mental problems and things like that because they could not produce. So as soon as you walk away from this imago Dei mindset, it ultimately won't work. Because why? Why do you value people? Why? Why? There is no reason why apart from Genesis 1 through 3 in our Judeo-Christian values. It's incoherent to say all people have intrinsic value when we also say all people are just evolved primates. If you are just an evolved primate, you have no intrinsic value. You only have value based on what you produce. Which means old people have no value if they can't produce anymore. Which means young people have no value if they can't produce. Which means handicapped people have no value. Let that sink in. If you believe that those people have value, then you have to found that belief on somewhere. This is why our Declaration of Independence said, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We could go on and say they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I want you to see this. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. All men are created equal. No, we're not. Some people can run faster, some people run slower. Some people have health problems, some people are really healthy, just naturally. Some people have a higher IQ than other people. Some people are taller, some are shorter. We are not created equal, except in the imago Dei. That we are created each equal in our nature as being in the image of God. That's what makes us equal. That is the basis of human rights that says all people have value. So I'm 100% for human rights, but we got to be careful because if we build human rights on another platform other than the Word of God, it will ultimately tumble because there's no reason for it. There's no reason for it. You have the fingerprints of God all over you. From your uniqueness to your free will, to your ability to create, to your ability to love, you have God's fingerprints all over you. You were made special. You are different. Second thing I want you to see, and this really is the bigger thing, God created you for partnership with Him. God created you for partnership with Him. So God created you in Eden and created humans in Eden and said, I'm giving you dominion of the land. I want you to run the earth. I want you to make something good out of it. And I really want you to do my will through you to bring it to earth. Are you with me? So God decided to partner with man to bring His will onto the earth. This is why Jesus said, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. In order for it to be done on earth as it is in heaven, some man has to start doing it. So God chooses, God gives us governorship, God gives us dominion of the land, and then says, listen, I want you to do my will through your life. Therefore, God is choosing to partner with man to bring His way of doing things, His kingdom, onto this earth. One of the saddest scriptures in all of the Bible is Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 30. Check this out. It says, I looked for someone, this is God talking, I looked for someone among them who would build up the wall and stand before me in the gap on behalf of the land, so I would not have to destroy it. But I found no one. Why is God looking for someone? Why isn't God just doing it Himself? Because God chooses to partner with humans to bring His will onto this earth. See, the world is sick with sin and we still have the cure. But we have to bring the cure. Now, this is where it gets a little more complicated. And that's what I want you to see. In this sense, God needs you. All the theologians in the world are like, God doesn't need anything. God is infinite and omnipresent and self-sufficient and self-sustaining and self-existent. God doesn't need anything. No. God doesn't need to need you. God chose to need you. God chose to operate on the earth through people like you and I. That's what God chose to do. It's up to us to allow God to operate on this earth through us. It's been said, we are the hands and feet of Jesus. You've all heard that, right? Why is that? It's because God uses you to do His will on the earth. Therefore, God needs you, not in the sense of like God is needy, but God chooses to partner with you. He chooses to need you. It's really that simple. And so God needs you. And you see this throughout the Pentateuch and really the Bible in general. But God created the earth and He needed Adam to populate it. He didn't just suddenly create 1 million people. He said, I'm going to start with one. You take it from there. You're the governor. You have dominion. You and Eve populate the earth. He got frustrated with man and he looked at Noah and he said, all right, I want you to build me a ship. Why didn't God just put the ship there and make it all happen? Because He says, I'm choosing to partner with man. God wanted to bless a nation and create a nation of His own. And so instead of creating out of nothing and making another Adam, He reached down and talked to Abraham. And he ends up making the nation of Israel out of them. He looks at Joseph when he gets ready to rescue Abraham's family. And he could have fixed the drought for his family alone, but he doesn't. He needs a man to do his work. He looks at Moses. God could have led the children of Israel out of bondage by himself. He could have done this and killed them all, right? But He doesn't. He used a man to step into that gap and be used of God to carry the people out of bondage. And God does this. And over in the Bible, God is looking for people that He can create the future with and through. So you partner with God because God needs to work with you. You partner with God to do something different. Why did Jesus one time say the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few? Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into the harvest field. Why? Because He knew that God uses men. Why did Jesus need to come at all? Why couldn't God just save in some other fashion? Why couldn't He have raised somebody else up? Because people could not fulfill the law, therefore God created Jesus, and this is why the humanity of Jesus and the glory and the divine nature of Jesus have to be together, because God needed a man, and Jesus was fully human in order to fulfill and carry out His plan. So we are the hands and feet of God. We are the body of Christ, which leads to this really big question. If we're the hands and feet of God, how dirty and calloused are our hands and feet? All right, here's the thing. Our part is natural. God's part is supernatural. God looked at Noah and He said, build an ark. Nothing about that seemed supernatural. It's a big boat. It's a lot of work. It's no fun. Neighbors probably going by, laughing at him, making fun of him. All that stuff's going on. God looked at Abraham and said, stick your staff into the water. Yeah, you crazy God? That makes no sense. But when he did the natural thing, the Red Sea parted. God looked at Abraham. I said Abraham. I didn't say Moses. Sorry. God looked at Moses, said, go to Pharaoh, and said, let my people go. Until he went in the natural, the plagues weren't going to happen that were supernatural. We have to go in the natural before the supernatural is going to come. You see this throughout the Bible. And a lot of times in Pentecostal world, we're always talking about the revival that's coming and when's the revival coming. I can tell you when the revival is going to come. When we in the natural start stepping up to the plate for God to use us in the spiritual. Until we work in the natural, we're not going to have a supernatural. We work in the natural, God super attaches to it, and it goes forward. What does that mean practically? That means in the natural, it's Sunday morning, I don't feel like going to church, I don't feel like serving in that opportunity, but in the natural, I'm still going to get up and go do it. In the natural, I don't have the money to tithe, but I'm going to do it, and so God can put His super onto my natural. In the natural, I don't want to come to restoration room. I got other things to do. I'm tired. It's been a long week. In the natural, I show up at restoration room. In the supernatural, God starts moving. You with me? We're not waiting on God. God's always waiting on us. And so we got to put our natural with God's super to make it supernatural. Because, and this is so important, and I got to kill this flaw because many of us, if you just grew up in church and you don't have much theology, you'll believe this and you've been told this. God's will is not always accomplished. I'm glad I got one amen from that. I'm going to mess you up a little bit. God's will is not always accomplished. Let that sink in. God's ultimate sovereign will is always accomplished. God will win in the end. However, His moral will, His day-to-day moral will is not always accomplished because He's still looking for a man who will stand in the gap and not finding them. God's moral will. So what are you talking about, Pastor Brent? You telling me there's kids right now in this community that are being molested by Uncle so-and-so every week. That's God's will? No, that's not God's will. There are starving kids living in horrible situations, all the abuse, all the things going on. Is that God's will? Of course that's not God's will. Why is it happening? Because God's looking for humans to stand in the gap and bring change. This is why we have to step out in the natural so God can take our natural, put a super with it, and create a better future. That's what the Church of Jesus Christ was meant to do. That's why we come together. That's why we formed. And the big lie is that something is God's will just because it is. That's not true whatsoever. Peter said God's will is that none should perish apart from Jesus Christ, apart from salvation. And we see that it happens all the time. God's will is not always done in that sense. God's will is for our church to grow. Does that mean we can all just sit back and not do anything and not serve and not sow and not share and not? No, of course not. We have to do our natural part so God can do His supernatural part. Which leads to point 3 in my last one, and we'll wrap up. You can only have partnership with God through covenant relationship. Covenant relationship. So in Genesis, and in Exodus as well, but you really see these incredible stories of covenants. You know, the Bible is divided into two parts, Old Testament, New Testament. That Testament word just means covenant. Old covenant and New covenant, divided into these two different sections. And you see multiple times in the Bible where God makes covenants with man. Now, that covenant word can seem a little distracting and crazy. It's simply agreements with man. It's a partnership with man. It's an agreement with man. The very first time you see it, He does it with Adam, and He puts him in the garden, and He gives him control, and He makes an agreement with him. And then you see it really very clearly with Abraham. God makes this covenant with Abraham, this agreement, and He says, Abraham, I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to bless your offspring, and you'll be like the sand on the sea, or sand by the sea, and the stars in the sky, and through your offspring I'll bless all nations. And He makes this agreement, this covenant with Abraham. Abraham's side was just to follow Him. It's really relatively easy. In fact, this is why God was faithful all the times when Abraham's offspring were unfaithful. Because the covenant with Abraham was not about Abraham's faithfulness. It wasn't about Abraham being perfect or doing everything right. It was about God being God. God said, I'm going to do this for you. It's not based on what Abraham did. And that's why God keeps being faithful with those people. Then you get another big covenant. This is the one we all have heard of, the Ten Commandments. Mount Sinai, they call it the Sinai covenant. You get this covenant, radically different covenant. This covenant said, if you do this, then I will do this. This is the agreement that most of us have with most everything in life. If you make your car payments, you get to keep your car. If you don't make your car payments, it will disappear from your driveway, right? This is the covenant most of us are familiar with. This is the way life works. And that's the covenant at Sinai. Over and over and over and over, you see God saying, if you do and follow my rules, then I will bless you and take care of you and love you and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't follow my rules, then I will take my hands off of you and it will be in destruction. The whole book of Deuteronomy is Moses preaching all these things that happen and telling the people those same things. So honor God, right? So therefore, it has a cause and effect in that one. Abraham, God just said, I'm going to do it, just because I choose to. Israelites, God said, if you do this, then I'll do this. If you don't do this, I won't do this. You with me? Yeah. So you get these covenants that are going on. Now, in the Exodus story, this weird, cool, strange thing happened. I mentioned it a minute ago. The 10th plague in the Exodus story, they go through all these plagues, and Pharaoh won't, he's back and forth, and he won't let them leave. So finally God has enough, and he actually pulls to Pharaoh what Pharaoh had already done. Back in Moses' time, Pharaoh had said, I'm going to kill all the firstborn sons, right? God says, all right, you did that to my people, I'm about to do that to your people. And so God says, the last plague, God says, tell Pharaoh that the firstborn sons of all of Egypt will die. But God is a gracious God compared to Pharaoh, who was not. And God said, all of your firstborn are going to die unless you take the hyssop branch, just a branch, smear it in the lamb of the blood of a lamb, spotless lamb, and put it over your mantle of your door, right? And if you do that, when the death angel comes to destroy you, if you do that, if the death angel comes, he will see that and he will pass over your house. That's the word Passover. That's where we get that from. He will pass over your house and he won't be destroyed. Now, after that plague, there's weeping and crying all over Egypt, and basically the Egyptians are like, get out of here, we're done with you. Like, just go, right? That becomes the Passover. Get into Exodus, you get into Leviticus, there's all these laws, there's all these feasts, and God creates this feast and he says, I want you to celebrate the Passover forever. Never forget this. I want you to have a Passover meal, Seder meal, and I want you to remember this Passover event forever. You with me? Fast forward about 1,400 years-ish. All of a sudden, they've been following this all this time, this Passover meal. Jesus enters into Jerusalem during a festival, the festival of Passover. He comes, they lay palm branches down at his feet, and everybody's in Jerusalem. There's all this excitement. They think maybe he's going to be the conquering hero. And Jesus, the night before he's betrayed, has the Passover meal, and he takes the cup and he says, this cup, and everybody knew what he was going to say. Oh yeah, this cup is about the Passover, 1,400 years. They've been taught all their life. They knew what the cup was about. But Jesus said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Whoa, back up, Jesus. No, not your blood. This is the Passover lamb's blood way back here. We're doing this in remembrance of him. We're remembering, not you, Jesus, who do you think you are? You can't change our history. This cup is a new covenant in my blood. As often as you meet together, do this in memory of me. Me. Memory of who? I thought it was the Passover lamb. No, me. And Jesus is saying that Passover lamb way back here was a foreshadowing. You love a great story. It's a foreshadowing of 1,400 years later when there would be a new Passover lamb that would not be a physical lamb, would be a human being who would be pure and spotless just like that. That's what John the Baptist said the first time he saw Jesus. John the Baptist is coming down, or Jesus is walking down to the water, and John the Baptist cries out, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. What's he talking about? It's that same lamb. It's that same picture. And at the Passover, it was the blood of Jesus that now created a new covenant. Jesus became our Passover lamb. Elijah, run up here fast. Jesus became our Passover lamb. What happened at Passover? Real fast, like faster than you're doing. Jesus became our Passover lamb. Get this. So what happens now, in Exodus, the death angel is coming, right? And he sees in this house, there is now blood over the door. So the death angel is coming to kill. The blood over the door said, nope, he's mine. You got to get through me to get to him. He's mine. When we use the terminology, because it's weird if you didn't grow up in church, we say, we're washed in the blood. Are you washed in the blood? You're like, is this weird? Like, what kind of weird cult is this? And we use those, and I get that. If you didn't grow up in church, there's weird things we say. I get that. What are we saying when we talk about the blood covering our life? When the death and destruction would want to come on you, God's saying, no, he's mine. He's mine. You got to go through my blood to get to him. That's what he's saying. You can go there. That's what he's saying. That's what it means. And you see all these years later. And so Jesus institutes this new covenant. Well, we have the Sinai covenant. We have the Abrahamic covenant. There was a covenant with David that was different. Covenant with Adam and Eve. There's some others. But there's this new covenant. So what kind of covenant would this be? What kind of covenant would these be? New covenant in my blood. Not your blood, in my blood. In other words, it's very similar to the Abrahamic covenant. God said, I'm just going to bless Abraham and I want you to follow me. That's really the only requirement. Sinai covenant, you had to do good in order to get good. Most of us like to bring that into our modern Christianity. But the covenant with Jesus says it is not your righteousness that gets you to God. It's God's grace that comes on you. You're not that good. You can't be that good. Stop trying to live by the Levitical law. You're not going to ever be that good. But God's grace will lift you up and it makes you his. And God wants to partner with us through Jesus. And it is through Jesus that the tempter comes and you and I are able to stomp on his head through the power of Jesus because he's already been defeated when he rose 3 days after being crucified. It's already been done. That was the promise all the way back there in Genesis that was fulfilled almost 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem by Jesus Christ. And it gives us the power to not be defeated by the tempter any longer because he's already been crushed. So God wants to partner with you through Jesus to bring his will on the earth. And that's what this whole blood thing's about. Like all this blood stuff in the church, what's that about? That's what it's about. It's just saying, you're mine. You're part of my DNA. You have my bloodstream on you. Stand up with me if you would. And this is what's unpopular, but it's true. That you can only get to God through a covenant or an agreement with Jesus. It's through his blood that you get to God. Jesus said, it's John 14:6. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father, meaning God, except through me. That's it. Not Muhammad, not Buddha, not Hare Krishna, not whoever else, not the flying spaghetti monster, whatever. It's only through Jesus, he is the doorway, that you get to God. Why? Because the Passover mantle is covered with his blood. And it's only through that door that leads to life, not destruction. It's all these pictures that you see in the Pentateuch that hopefully start to make more sense at the end. God wants to partner with us. All right, some of you in this room, you've never accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and you've never given your life to him. And today is your day to do that. And maybe this makes a little bit more sense now, I don't know. And maybe some of you are still on the journey, but there's some here that's like, this is your moment. You want to say, I'm going to follow you. Not because of your righteousness. You're just making a decision to say, like Abraham did, I'm going to follow God. I'm going to follow Jesus. I'm going to give my life to him. And I want to give you that opportunity before we wrap this service up. So would you bow your heads with me and close your eyes for just a second? If you're in this room and you say, Pastor, I need to surrender my life to Christ. I want to start following him. If that's you, just stick your hand up and wave it at me. I want to pray over you. I don't want to embarrass you or anything. I just want to pray over you. Amen. Amen. Come on, around the room, pray with me. Say, Jesus, I admit I'm a sinner. And I believe that you died on the cross for my sins. So from this day forward, I will follow you. I will make you my Lord and my Master. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Hey guys, wasn't that such an amazing message? If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow our podcast. Also, make sure to share this with your friends on social media and use the hashtag #MyAriseChurch. For more information or to give to this ministry, go to myarisechurch.com. I hope to see you guys soon.